Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation. My name is James Campbell, and on today's episode, I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Nanette Hoogslag and Adrian Holme, two of our editorial team from our very celebrated and wonderful Journal of Illustration. So it's wonderful to have you both here today. I appreciate your time, and welcome to the In Conversation podcast. How's it going?
Cool. It's really
good. It's good.
Excellent. Well, I'm really glad to have you on. And to start with, I'm going to go to you, Nanette, first. But can you just tell us a bit about yourself, perhaps what your research interests are, where you're based, and if you teach, that kind of thing.
Hi, thank you for having us. I'm Nanette Hoogslag. I'm principal editor of the Journal of Illustration. I've been doing this now for, I think, 3 years, but maybe longer. It feels like 3 years. But I've been with the journal for quite a long time. But in my other life, I'm the deputy head of the Cambridge School of Art, and where I lead school. And in another life, I'm an illustrator. And in another life, I'm a researcher. And my research interest is really into the role of illustration in both sort of the printed and the digital environment. It's the banal question of, if somebody's happy to pay for your image, what are their expectations? What do they want that illustration to do? And that to do is really what I'm interested in.
Thank you, Nanette. So you wear a few hats, to say the least. So I really do appreciate your time today. And Adrian, how about yourself?
Yeah, I suppose I've got a few hats as well. I don't know if it's as many as Nanette. I've got a background in art and science and in writing and editing, both in science publishing and writing across a range of disciplines, really. I'm interested in the history and philosophy of science, the relationship between science, technology, and culture. And of course, I'm really interested in picture making, picturing, illustration, drawing, and art more generally. I taught for 18 years at Campbell on the BA illustration, and now I'm working on the MA Art and Science, where I've also worked for a number of years at Central St Martin's at UAL. I was in on illustration research from almost the beginning. It was set up by our colleagues Amelia Johnson and Chris Glynn at Cardiff, and I was there at the first conference and the first symposium. And and then I was also involved in the setting up of the journal. So right from the beginning of the journal. Yeah, so it's quite a long association and a love of illustration.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Well, again, thank you both again for your time. And it's interesting you mentioned science there, Adrian, because that's something that always strikes me about this publication. Every time I take it to a conference that has intersections between science and art, it's always one of the most picked up and leafed through volumes on the table. And that shouldn't be a big surprise, but it does still always pique my interest to see who's leafing through the pages. And often they have a background in biology or physics or something like that. So that's always kind of intrigued me. But in a nutshell, and I'll start with you, Adrian, on this, what's the journal all about from your perspective? What's, its kind of aims and scope, and, just for our readers who might not be familiar with it, what's it all about?
Well, it's called, it arose, as I said, from the Illustration Research Network. So in a sense, illustration research has been kind of at the heart of the journal. And there was a feeling when we set up the journal that that illustration research and illustration as a kind of discipline was not taken as seriously as it might be. And I'd often encounter students in my teaching who were a little bit apologetic, about being on an illustration course, as though, they might be aspiring artists. And I always felt it was so wrong that anyone should apologize for illustration. And of course, it was always very irritating when people say, oh, that work is just illustrative, and they kind of really demean the subject. So there was a sense really of wanting to establish the seriousness of illustration as a subject for research and as a really central discipline in the history of our culture and in our culture today.
No, I think that's great. And again, I really appreciate you highlighting that, because I think we who love and work in the arts and humanities more generally are often, you know, the butt of a few jokes here and there. And of course, intellect, we solely focus on arts and humanities, really. So we've had to fight tooth and nail to make sure that we, our brand, and of course a lot of the publications that we represent are given the, you know, the seriousness, and people take them seriously. So I can really appreciate that conundrum. And for you, do you think that it's vital that a subject like illustration has a peer-reviewed journal publication, such as the one that you're involved with, to really kind of break through those boundaries?
Absolutely. You know, because obviously peer-reviewed journals are second only really to sort of reviewed books as the kind of gold standard of publishing. So it's really important, really, in establishing the credibility of the discipline. So yeah, and I think it does a really important job. I mean, it's an interesting journal in the sense that it's emerged from within the art schools. So you were talking about the connection with science. So the connection with science can be a little bit more unusual, but we are also kind of illustration in I think in a wonderful way faces out to numerous other disciplines. So there is a sense also of reaching out. We've had a couple of symposia which have touched on science. The last one, apparatus, in Istanbul, touched on the role of apparatus and technology in illustration, and we had one some years ago on science and knowledge and illustration, the illustration of knowledge. So we, you know, and it was really exciting at Istanbul how there were scientists presenting there as well. So this interdisciplinarity of it is really important to us.
What a perfect city and location for intersectionality as well, Istanbul.
Absolutely, intersection of the whole world.
Right. And Nanette, what about yourself? Does that kind of chime with you? Is there anything you want to add to what Adrian said?
No, I think absolutely. Adrian really captured it well, but I think what I find really important about the journal is that it is an illustration about and through illustrations, so very much aimed at practice-based research, or that's the heart of it. We have a lot of historical articles, socially sort of placed articles, but it is the illustrator's practice and the illustrator's reflection that is captured most. Making the illustrator the researcher, thinking of illustration as an expanded practice. So bringing in, and this is again where it touches on science, but it touches on fine art, it touches on language, it touches on many different areas where we bring that, we celebrate that crossover, but also look within illustration at a very, very broad sense of what it is. And anybody that reads the journal will always see the battles over the definition, which is what journals always do. We battled over the definition, and Gillian Grove wrote an amazing article, and I don't think she'll silence anybody of us on to say what it is. But because it's seen as something aside, because within the design studies, it's seen as an aside to design. In language studies, it's seen as something that is supporting language rather than language in and of itself. There is a space where we need to declare what these visuals, what this visual narrative, what this visual storytelling, what these images, what this drawing, what it is and what it does, and why it's a very valid and rigorous way of exploring and deserves our attention. And I think the diversity of the articles underline that.
Well, and also a real wealth of depth now, because what are we in, 13th volume? You know, it's been going since 2014, I believe. So that's quite a lot of material, and probably a few back and forths, a few arguments here and there, no doubt. But do you strive to work for a definition of illustration? Is that something that's kind of in the heart of the journal, or is it really more about this dialogue? Because my next question was, do you define the term illustration, you know, or are you more about just having more of a fluid conversational focus?
I think we are constantly defining it. I made badges out of it. For every conference, we wear badges with different definitions, and I think I've now collected about 400.
Oh, right.
You do need to define it, and not because I want to have the definition, but because it is still unformed, unshaped, undefined, still an open framework. I believe everyone who wants to talk about it needs to say, and this is what I think it is. So we know the starting point of the author, of the researcher. Okay, this is your starting point, and now I understand where you want to take us. And the next one can have a different starting point. And this is where we start to weave that blanket of knowledge, don't we? Ultimately, we will have a sense of space. I don't think we'll have a point, but I think we'll demark a space which we believe is illustration and not fine art and not literature and not design, but it's a very sort of fluid space with open borders. Let's say, put it that way.
I mean, I think that's wonderful, and I think one of the other things that really separates the journal, in my mind, is that obviously you're open to general submissions, and that information's all there on the website and easy for people to submit if they have any interest in illustration as a discipline. But of course, the journal, as Adrian kind of alluded to, is very much connected with conferences from its formation and still continues to be. So perhaps you could both talk a little bit about, I suppose, like almost the format of the journal and how these themes are so important to what comes out and how you sort of see the journal.
So we are just busy with the 16th symposium, because the symposium had been before the journal. So, there's a lot to come, and it's really exciting, and hopefully we'll do a shout out on the call for papers for that one. But these themes come from the community. So where Adrian helped me out here. I'm embarrassed. The first conference was the
first one at Cardiff was on alchemy.
Oh wow!
Alchemy.
It was entitled Alchemy, and it was a very broad interpretation of alchemy. And I've got a particular interest in alchemy, so it was a joy for me to that was how I first got involved. Actually, It
wouldn't be a title you think, oh, that's illustration, and we explain why it is and what we mean by alchemy, but there is this constantly trying to put a different lens on it, right? So it's about, we've had them about writing, we had them about traveling. Yeah, heritage has just been, we had it about the transitional position, we had it about education, we had blind spots, which I think is slightly more self-reflecting than the others, but we literally just come back from Istanbul on apparatus in illustration technology, and to my surprise, a lot of people want to talk about AI. Actually, when we're developing that, it was very much coming from board members like Adrian, from the love of that relationship between illustration and the machine and technology, how we not only illustrate it, but it is part and parcel of illustration. How illustration is part of current technology, always responds to current technology, because that's where communication sits. And if there's communications, that's where illustration sits. So it often this idea that illustration is just about paper, I would like to debunk that hard, because it is about the latest communication technology, and that's where it forms its relationships. Adrian, I bet you can say a hell of a lot more on that, but I'm passing you the
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, going back to the notion of definition, really, because I think that the breadth of the symposium reflects the kind of breadth of what you might call a definition, in the sense that illustration has always fascinated me so much. I mean, I used to collect sort of, textbooks with scientific illustrations in it when I was a kid, kind of thing, But it's open to other disciplines and interfaces with other disciplines in a really, really interesting way. And in some ways, the definition, it makes the definition rather loose and rather flexible in one sense. And yet, as Nanette is sort of alluding, I think, there is also a core. There's a core to it, and it's kind of, what is that core? And in a sense, when we teach, there's a need also to reach out to other areas and to look at those connections, but also to find out something about teach from something of that core. And I do believe it has a core. And it isn't just about paper, which it was historically. You know, it was about book illustration, and we came from that sort of field in many ways. But it has a core which, you know, you might define it in various ways, but it's a core which relates to the visual, but also relates to the literary. And these way that words and images kind of intersect and connect is something for me at the core. But what I also wanted to say is that I think as illustration has become an extraordinarily popular subject and increasing in popularity, you know, and the increase in the mushrooming of illustration courses, the growth of illustration courses reflects that. And I think in some ways students have some basic kind of understanding that this is also a good preparation for this very fluid world of the 21st century, partly because it isn't so totally kind of tied down in that way. It has a kind of openness as well as a core.
Yeah, so I mean, it's so easy to riff on this. It's so easy to talk about this because it's about that autonomy. It is about the maker, and that's what students get. It is about communication. It's about audiences. So whether it's for children or it's a very dedicated science audience, or whether it's for a particular type of visualization, or whether it's decoration. We had a wonderful conference dedicated to decoration and celebrating that, and taking that modernist sort of dampener off it and celebrating it, and actually saying decoration has a hugely important role. I think there is enormous need for it, and it's an undervalued space. I really like Sal Steinberg's description of illustration as by stealth. That's something that kind of is giving conversations or meaning or context by stealth, not because it's big in a museum or loud. It's because it's in a book, it's in your magazine, it's on your packaging, it's on a wall scribbled by somebody. It's what your kid does when, you know, he or she's drawing something, the kind of storytelling through their images. So what's that all about then? And we do that everywhere in every culture. I've not met a culture yet that's not making images to tell stories through. And isn't that what illustration does? So, yeah.
Indeed. If I could just add that I think illustration, it can be so many things, and you know, it can be critical, and you know, coming from within you know, the world of academia, you know, there's certain criticality that's kind of expected, and you'll see that reflected in the journal. But there's also pleasure, and I sometimes think that pleasure is so kind of, you know, the pleasure of looking at images, you know, which we all knew as children, is still somehow kind of can be there in the subject, you know, in a way that has been somewhat demeaned in the art world at sometimes beauty and pleasure come back, and sometimes they're kind of cast out of the fine art, the rarefied world of fine art, in which I also teach. But yeah, something about pleasure, it can be part of it as well. I don't know how you feel about that, Nanette, if that's kind of...
Yeah, I agree. I do pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, we do pleasure.
Well, let me ask this as well then, because you both alluded to how the journal has definitely made inroads into making this, you know, the study of illustration, you know, taken more seriously. But is there anything else you'd like to add about that, about how the journal has advanced the recognition of illustration really as an academic field? You know, and all these things are wonderful, these intersections. But is there anything you would like to sort of just say there so people are aware of, like, why the journal's had such an important role?
There wasn't a journal of illustration before, so
Yeah.
to be quite simple, and there's the Mona McCannon, who's one of the originators of the journal. I don't know if it's true or a myth, but she said she had a hard time getting academic publishers to convince that illustration was a proper pucker area with interest. So she maybe had to even convince intellect. I don't know. James, you look it up.
Well, I mean, I could say quickly, like, I know that as a for want of a better term, the underdog subject matter is something that Masood, our founder, would have been, you know, profoundly interested in. But I believe we'd already published the Journal of Drawing Research and Practice, and I think from my from my memory, because I was at the company at the time, I think Masood was really kind of like, well, what's the difference? How are we defining it? And of course, it is more of a slippery subject than that. So I think that was probably why he might have taken a couple of conversations to get him and then us on board. But I'm very glad that you did manage to do this, because it's a hugely important and impactful publication. And like many of our subjects, they often start, outside of the academic, world, or certainly outside of the serious academic world. And like we said earlier on, the journal, with a conference, with the quality of scholarship that people like yourselves are producing and teaching, all work together to then elevate and to increase the reception and the respect that's given to these kinds of subjects that are a bit more practice-led or creative. And it feels the notion of practice as research is now extremely common, but if you go back to the 80s, it was not, and you go back and it was people didn't take things like that seriously. And one of the reasons how Intellect was formed and founded as a business was because Masood's own research was, it was between science and art, looking at artificial intelligence and things like that in different contexts, and it was hard to find a peer-reviewed publication that was interested in his approach. And then, of course, people don't take you seriously unless you can publish in such peer-reviewed publications. So yeah, it is a little bit kind of convoluted, but I'm really glad that we ended up getting there. But while we're talking about practice as research, though, that might be an interesting question, and I'd be good to get both of your points of view on this. And I'll start with Adrian. What's the role of practice as research, or practice-led research, however you want to define that, in the journal? Is it an important part of what you seek in terms of submissions and themes? Does it bear on every issue, or is it sort of by the by?
I think you'll find it in every issue, and there's always been a sense that because the people that set it up are by and large practitioners and practicing illustrators as well, there's always been a sense that the way that an illustrator looks at the world, interrogates the world, is completely valid in its own right. So I think you'll see that kind of research, practice led, and that runs through the journal issues. And of course, it's gone along, with increasing numbers of people doing PhDs and practice-based PhDs as well. So you'll also see some of the critical research that the people doing PhD level is feeding back in through the journal as well.
There's quite a systemic shift there at some point as well, I think, wasn't there, where people started to or needed to do PhDs in these creative topics. And I think that collapsed the envelope, if you will, between those who do and those who talk about and teach. And it's like, well, actually, those who do often then migrate into academic teaching positions or research positions later in their career, or move horizontally, that kind of thing. And
that's right. And I think it's very much also because it applies as well to practice-based research in the arts, in the arts more generally. There's a kind of valuing of things that are not only in words, as well as actually the methods of an illustrator, the methodology of an illustrator, the validity of illustration as methodology. And I'm sure Nanette will have a lot more to say about that. But
it is interesting. I'm just reflecting on what is in the current issues, and there's a reflection on and through practice. So people will talk about a piece of work they've done and what they've evolved through that work, what thoughts and ideas they've evolved through that. You have illustration practitioners, researchers who've stumbled upon or come upon sort of a certain frame or a certain set of ideas, or an idea that they want to tease apart and see what's in there. You've got practitioners who got fascinated in historic areas and do a research on this, and to such an extent that they want to publish that. And I do think it's really valid that more and more not only PhD researchers going on, which is absolutely great, but of course they themselves remain interested, and so they form the new sort of next sort of group of researchers. And if you think about what is typical of this group of people, and let's not generalize, because there's going to be people now saying I'm not like that. But what I typical is that they do not come from a naturally shaped academic background where there is a way of working, how you do this. They do not come from an art critical discourse, which in fine art sits where you know your pantheon of theorists and philosophers. That is far less prominent in illustration, maybe even in some courses absent, because it's such a practice-based place. So that creates both really interesting hybrids, people sort of taking their framework and building their theoretical background or story from a lot of places, but it also causes problem that it is from a lot of places that maybe you could say there isn't such a rigor to it. You come to people who actually do not have a theoretical rigor, but have a lot to say, have really valid insights. How then, as a journal, can you turn that into a piece of communication, a piece of text, a piece of writing that has is of value to those who are building their research, building their understanding of illustration upon it? So it's both the discovery of the researcher, the author, of wow, isn't this amazing? I want to share this. But also the need to make that discovery of a level that it is building on that sort of on the illustration knowledge. And there's often some tension in there. There's often some space in there where we think, how can we harvest that without destroying the authenticity, without forcing them in a certain sort of fixed framework, and yet making sure that this is the kind of level of knowledge building that will help the whole community, not just the individual who's done a discovery. That is complex. We have a lot of discussion about it between us. Things like the visual essay is a discussion from that, but also we are now Illustration Research Network's website is now a place where we can have a slightly more looser discussion about what the research could be and could do before it gets to a level where people have to really chew and knuckle down and write that piece that is of the academic rigor. So to create a stepped environment and to also think about what is an illustration framework, illustration research framework? How can we write about it? Should we write about it? Should we show it? And if we show it, how can that be rigorous? Lively discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's just a couple of things to pause on there. To be clear, you're quite experimental in terms of the formats and type of research that you'll accept, and it's not that you're just looking for PhDs, theorists, and theoretical perspectives on different methods and things. You're open to practitioners, people that don't necessarily have a scholarly background, and that's one of the reasons why you do pursue these visual essays and these different kinds of research outputs. So it sounds like that's definitely something that you're open to. And then I was wondering if perhaps you could explain a little bit more about some of the values and challenges that you associate with the visual essay format.
So I think the visual format is really exciting, and in a way, in current communication contexts, makes absolute sense. Or a multimedia contribution, I think we should aim for. I know printed, that is not easy, but I think we need to take that space, because writing is just only one form of discovery, of one form of expressing discovery. One of the issues is, of course, that the ambiguity of the visual itself. So where in research you want to get as close to a sort of a singular description or a singular expression as possible, so people get what you mean.
Mm.
And writing is the vehicle that we've been using. An image is notoriously ambiguous. That's why we love illustration, right? So how then can we make a structure? Can we make a frame? Can we have, for lack of a better word, a policy as a journal to say, yeah, we accept that, we don't accept that. This is, how do you peer review a visual essay? Who then, are we looking for composition? No, we're not looking for composition and color and whether something drawn well or not. That's by the by. But what is it that we are trying to extract from a visual essay is complex. And we find, for instance, that we do need word. We do need to have that written mode to give a steer. We're not in that space yet where we can just put an image down and then everybody is going like, wow, that is an amazing discovery. So yeah, we're discovering that we need scaffolding. It needs that relationship with word. We need sequence, so it's often told over pages. And we also need to allow for a sense of poetry. So we want possibly something very different from it than you want from a piece of written text. And that brings discussions, because other people say, no, that's not why I'm reading a journal. I don't want to read a journal to get a piece of work that's not clear.
I think it's the visual essay is a format that is very open, really, as Nanette says. And I think we've always wanted in the journal to have a space that was kind of inclusive, experimental, and open, while at the same time, trying to assure some level of quality. So that's kind of a challenge, and you've got really experimental stuff, if you like. I mean, clearly, historically, the visual essay, in a sense, is not new. I mean, the medieval stained glass windows, which tell biblical stories in a visual form, people who are largely illiterate, are a stunning kind of visual essay, although there was a text that they were all familiar with, so they kind of knew to what it was referring, so it was kind of anchored in that. And then, of course, you've got the world of manga and the world of comics, and when you've got words are so kind of closely integrated into the words and image, then of course you can have that. You don't need so much kind of explication. But I suppose really, I think the visual essay is difficult. I think it's often students often think, if there are visual essays, they often think it's an easier option, and in fact you have to be very, very good a good visual essay. And I think in publishing, it can often require some form. I mean, there's that famous John Berger essay, isn't there, in Ways of Seeing, which is a kind of visual essay. But hey, it's John Berger. I mean, he was very smart at manipulating images. So it can often require some form of explication along with it in words, as Nanette says, and also references. I mean, I think references can be really useful. Bibliography can be really helpful. But I think it's great that there is a space where we are open to this experimentation in this form and communication in this form.
Well, talking about experimentation, I'll stay with you, Adrian, for a moment. I wanted to ask, sort of going forward, what overlooked areas and perspectives in illustration do you think need to be identified or pursued more actively?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think for me, it comes out of, well, I mean, there's the obvious kind of interface with technology that, has always kind of been sort of transformative in illustration, and which is going on. And this came up inevitably, those dreaded words, artificial intelligence, came up in Istanbul. But I think there's also the things about, further digging into the relationship with other disciplines, actually, the technical illustration is an interesting form. And because we come from the art school, by and large, then it's not, necessarily to the fore in the art school, as the way it might be in other disciplines like architecture or engineering or whatever. So there's something quite interesting about that. But I also think that one can consider, as Leah Fusco has argued, that illustration can be considered as a humanity more broadly. So there's also something about the interface with the other humanities that will be further dug into.
That's interesting. And I guess just a quick follow-up. This is a bit of a naive question, probably. But do you find that when you're dealing with people whose knowledge of illustration as a practical or an academic discipline is a bit rudimentary, do you find that they think of it more as a technical skill, a technical, draftsmanship, almost more so than like its own art form, or it's more about draftsmanship and creativity? Is that just me being reductive?
No, there are common sort of stereotypes and prejudices against it. Going to the most extreme of saying, "Oh, that's just illustration,"
right?
Is an appalling way of looking, or like going, "It's just decoration." It's probably a problem in the way the word is used, because people don't necessarily pick up go onto a site and see a funny cartoon and think, "Oh, that's illustration," or they buy greeting cards and they think that's illustration, or a children's book and they think that's illustration. So there is a sense that we perhaps need to communicate the true breadth and richness of the subject.
I mean, that's slightly neat from my outsider's perspective, but I'll go over to Nanette now. And what do you think about areas and perspectives that should be further investigated?
Well, I have two great wishes. One, I think, is obvious. The Journal of Illustration research takes place most often, predominantly in the West, and then even more further, because we're an English language journal. We get an English language perspective, American, England. I believe completely, profoundly, that illustration is a global language and it's part of every global culture, and we're not hearing from within, or even from an outsider's look upon. And so that's a long-standing wish, to bring a much bigger readership and a much bigger authorship to this field. And I think that's vital. And if there's any way, shape or form I can do that, bringing more communities in, bringing more voices in, taking our dominant voice out of it, I would be very, very happy. Then I think that's great success. There's another side to it, is that illustration is also a commercial practice. It's an economic reality. We often don't want to talk about it because it's quite banal. It's got other values that are often goes against artistic values. But I think that's the beautiful place of illustration. We have to deal with that reality, and we'd rather not, thank you very much. And I think we'd rather should. And I think that brings a whole different lens to what illustration is and does, and why somebody pays money for what we do. They commission us, they want something from us. That puts the illustrator in a rather precarious position, or powerful position. It talks to an audience for a reason, and the reason are often not their own. It's the reason from whoever has requested that image to become part of their world. I think that's a really interesting space to be, and it's most often ignored. And I would love that conversation to be part of illustration, because that's in reality that's slightly sits outside fine art, but it's the center of in illustration reality. And we've had people come in and be angry with us and saying, "Oh, you academics, all you want to talk about is, your beautiful little research, but the reality of, the field is," and they're like, "Yeah, you're right, but come and write for us. Don't shout at us. Come and tell and research and explore that story, because it's complex and it's really, really at the heart of what we do." So those are the two.
It's always had this commercial aspect, just as actually art, pretends it doesn't have a commercial aspect, but of course it's a multi-billion-pound industry,
and always has been.
It'd be great to have something about the stylist as illustration.
Yeah, that That sounds fascinating, actually. Well, you're leading me on to my next question, really, which is to sort of focus a bit more on the future more generally out of that initial question. And I wanted to ask about exciting call for papers you might have out there in the world now, or that things that you're looking to develop in the future. You've obviously mentioned the global south and sort of commercial realities. Are there any formal CFPs, Nanette, that you have out there?
Yeah.
All right, let's hear about them, and then I'll come to Adrian and ask you a sort of an adjacent question on this topic as well.
So we got two, because we just had the conference, and because we work from themes. The conference that's come out is apparatus, illustration and technology in the broadest sense. And hopefully, James, you will sort of connect some way, shape or form the call for papers to this interview. That'd be lovely. And we'd love people to consider the role of illustration in technology, the role of technology in illustration, and anything in between. That call for papers out now. And we would love your response to that before the end of February. But we're also having a next conference. So we have a call for conference presentations or papers. And we have the next conference that will be in November 26. And the theme there is failure and resistance. And I love that theme. I think it's a golden theme. So it's all around normativity. It's all around ideas of Jack Halberstam on what failure is and does, and how that's actually a breeding ground for creativity, for otherness. It is about otherness, but it's also about forms of resistance. I think it's very current as a theme, again, very broad, and it has the potential for the most amazing contribution. So I'd love people to consider that. So those are the two that are going. We are talking with people who are interested in hosting a conference, because often our journals start with a conference, but that's very open and fluid right now. So it's also an invitation, particularly Global South. If you think, I would love to bring my theme, my place, my fascinations to a conference, make that the heart of a conference, and I can bring that conference to my location, I'd love to talk to you and love to see how we can develop that.
Well, I was going to say, you're just making me think about colleagues that I've worked with at the National Institute of Design and IIT in India, where I know that they have a real rich heritage of illustration and studies around those topics. And then, of course, I'm thinking about some of the Indigenous studies stuff that I've encountered in Canada, New Zealand, and to a lesser degree in Australia, especially. And beyond. So there's just a few things there that are obviously hot topics in many disciplines that would really welcome, potentially a regional conference or some engagement with those CFPs. And Adrian, how about yourself? Is there anything that, any burning desires of anything that you'd like to see go out as a CFP, or anything you're kind of working on or encountered that you'd like to see in the journal?
I mean, I suppose there are many potential things, but I mean, I think it's no, I mean, I'm really looking forward to working on assisting on the apparatus editing, and we should mention actually Ilgim Alaka and Dilek Yordem, our Turkish colleagues, who have just put together this brilliant symposium in Istanbul. So that will lead to an issue of the journal. So I mean, there's three wonderful things in the pipeline at the moment, aren't there, Nanette? There's the Heritage Symposium, which will be extraordinary. That was led by Rachel Emily Taylor, and then there's Apparatus, which will follow, and then the Failure Symposium. So there's a lot in the pipeline. I would say that we do have an openness to people approaching us and saying, we would like to hold a meeting on this. Would you kind of sanction it? So we can kind of give our sort of branding, if you like, to meetings that we think, this would be it would be a great thing to go out under the Illustration Research Network Journal of Illustration rubric. So we're very open to that. So people should kind of contact us if they are interested in having local meetings such as that. It could be a one-day symposium or something like that.
I think that would be fantastic. I just interject quickly just to say that we will, at the end of this interview, there will undoubtedly be a description, and we'll put some links in there so people can go and find those CFPs, and of course your contact details through the journal site, so that then people can reach out to you and share their ideas and potential opportunities for collaboration. Nanette, I think I interrupted you there though. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I just want to say that the reason why we're so, where we kind of are, and again, this is one of our editorial board members, Senia Kopolova, has she taken the illustration research website and is making it into a place where that kind of initiatives, which are not big conferences, but projects that people want to give attention to, early research, PhD research that is just developing, she will be able to give that space. So whether we see the journal as a very sort of clear, demarked place where we talk in a rigorous way, at an academic rigorous level about illustration, we have that broader space where we can have more fluid, more open, and more sort of experimental conversations going, which I think is a breeding ground and a middle ground for students and the journal, but also breeding ground for new ideas. So I'd like to plug that as a space.
Brilliant. I think we should link to that as well, because that sounds like a fantastic opportunity for a lot more diversity of conversation and, again, collaboration. Adrian, did you have something else to add there?
There was one final thing where I guess we're coming towards the end there. There's one thing I wanted to add, really, that Nanette has mentioned Desdemona McCannon, but I do want to mention her again, because I think if it were not for Desdemona McCannon, I don't think the journal would have been set up. She was really the main instigator after the people at Cardiff had kind of set up illustration research. Des played such a pivotal role, so I would like to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and on behalf of Intellect, of course, we very much acknowledge that debt that we owe Desdemona, and also both of you and your whole team and the board members and all the contributors. It really is such an important journal with such a lively sort of culture and community behind it. And it's, you obviously had some challenges, and it's incredible to see what you've achieved in 13 years or whatever it is now. I'm not quite letting you off the hook quite yet, though. I wanted to ask you a couple of just quick time questions, a couple of fun questions, just to end things off with. And I wanted to, again, just start with a pretty simple one. I'll go to you, Adrian, first. What for you is the most rewarding part about editing this journal?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it's lovely when it comes out and you see this kind of this beautiful finished package, especially the fact that it is still printed as well as online. I think that the other rewarding thing is working with people who perhaps have not published before. Sometimes they're amazing sort of practitioners, but you can work with them, and I think we are very supportive actually of people. So that's a particular pleasure, is to see the work flourish in this kind of form and to bring a practitioner's work to life in the journal and to work with them. Yeah.
Thank you. And Nanette, what about yourself? What's the most rewarding part of this job for you?
I absolutely agree with Adrian. I think it's the beginning where all is possible and you get all these amazing abstracts and you go, oh, this is going to be fantastic. It's working with an author, a researcher in developing their writing, and that can be a struggle, but when it gets there, it's really, really great to see. It's a great relationship to have. And then when that thing comes through the door, you think, oh yeah, that's what I did it for. For me, that's important.
Okay. And then let me ask you this, Adrian. I was wondering, this again, I'll put you on the spot a bit here, but do you have any great influences? Has anyone really been a big influence on you, either in terms of your academic career, your writing, your practice, or just in life in general?
Gosh, that's big.
Just a small question. It's just a little,
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are particular writers, I'm something writer, editor. I mean, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, those kind of 20th century writers who, did so much to kind of interrogate the Carter things.
Sort of what the sort of work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of
You know, I think Walter Benjamin is still, you know, almost 100 years after, you know, he was writing, is still very, very relevant, and I'm really enjoying, with all her faults, I'm really enjoying Hannah Arendt's writings. So yeah, those are kind of good influences. In other areas, I'm enjoying listening to Kurt Weill in music.
Yeah.
That's the contemporary Kurt Weill, not the 1930s version.
Yeah, oh, very cool. Yeah, that name's come up a couple of times in some of our books recently as well, where we publish a lot on music, of course. So, that's interesting. Nanette, what about you? Any great influences on your life or career?
Well, yeah, no, I find that one of the questions that sends me in a complete panic.
It's a bit of a tricky one, I got to admit it, but you know that's why we throw it in.
Because it's like, who's that one person? And I thought, well, my mother.
I mean, that's a good answer. It's definitely a good answer, and you won't be the first person on this podcast to have suggested it either. So
there is that, and then there's, of course, I was one of those illustrators that couldn't, you know, that kind of heard a little bit about sort of theory and all that. My beloved husband, I think he's been a huge influence in actually opening that door, and introducing me to a world which I was absolutely not accustomed to. And then starting a PhD and thinking that I'd go to a library that was all about illustration books and finding none. And then being supported by my supervisors in, well, try this. Why don't you read this? And the book I read was by My Mother's a Computer by Catherine Hales. And that was such an eye-opener. I was like, yeah, that's what I mean. Oh, you know, oh, great. So there's constantly, there are people that kind of open that door. Indeed, the Amsterdam sort of early hacker scene, where sort of it was kind of cool to mix theory with kind of alternative culture. And not that I got it, I have no idea who they were talking about, but I had a sense that it was kind of cool to do that, and that was great. So yeah.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing those. And then to close, I just have one final question for you both. Now, I'm a big avid collector of wildlife field guides, like you kind of David Sibley type illustrative guides, you know, particularly birds, butterflies, a big thing for me. And I've got quite a few from the Victorian period, you know, the reproductions, not originals. I'm, you know, my publisher's salary pool doesn't stretch quite that far, but I love those early illustrations and then how that's evolved over time. And again, I'm putting you guys on the spot here, but I was just wondering for you, is there any iconic illustration or book or something that really captivates you that you would like to share with our audience, you know, for them to go and sort of check it out, or, you know, or just something you'd like to share? Adrian, I'll go to you first.
Gosh, that's such a difficult world. It's such a huge and rich world, isn't it? You know, I've got a fondness for botanical illustration.
Yeah.
And I've got a good friend and colleague, George Meller, who teaches at Campbell, who really, you know, we've got a sort of shared love of botanical illustration. And some of the Czech printed books of botanical illustration by Czech illustrators from, I suppose, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There's some beautiful work that came out. They're a real joy.
Oh, I'm based in Tucson in Arizona, and there's a real rich heritage here of sort of cacti and succulent illustrations that you can often go to thrift stores and secondhand bookshops and buy these packs of cards and things. So that really piqued my interest in the sort of botanicals. And then one of the companies that we're kind of affiliated with through a distribution partnership, through, you know, we both share similar distributors and things like that, is the Kew Gardens, who, you know, got a lot of time. And they have some wonderful books that are available on botanicals as well. So that's an area that I'm slowly getting into myself as well. And Nanette, same question to you though. Anything that you'd want to highlight?
Well, you made me think when you talked about botanical illustration. I used to collect medical books with those pop-out. And in that genre of collecting stuff, I have a huge collection of orange wrappers, which was a whole genre. So packaging, cigarette packaging. I've bought cigarettes without smoking them. Particularly the Belgian ones are really good. But the one illustrator that I still keep thinking, and is absolutely brilliant, and he's well known. It is Saul Steinberg. I really love his work. I love what he does. I love how his images are just sort of sublimely conceptual and engaging and open and bringing people in and communicative. I think he's brilliant in that, or was, I suppose you talk about it. And somebody who really influenced me in understanding that illustration can be something else, and yet be that sort of very easy to read image. I love it for that. But yeah, I collect a lot of sort of packaging because I think it's a form of picture making, illustration, which is so overlooked and yet often so engaging. I love going to America, going to an American store, and particularly sort of the health food stores. They have some amazing packaging going there.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm a little desensitized to it now, having lived here for quite a few years. But yeah, no, definitely, especially the more Americana 50s, 60s kind of stuff, 30s stuff, you know, pre and post World War II. You know, when I first moved here, that stuff was so iconic. I'd take photos of everything like that I could see, you know, because it was just like, oh my God, that's real Americana type stuff. But I think that's about all we have time for today. So on that wonderful note, I just want to thank you both deeply for taking the time to speak with me, for joining me on In Conversation. I could talk to you both all day. I think we probably just need to have like another podcast where we just talk about artifacts and illustrations and things like that. But Adrian and Nanette, thank you both for your time. I know there's another issue will be coming out soon, so I urge people to keep an eye on the www.intellectbooks.com website. Look for Journal of Illustration, where the latest issue will be posted. And of course, all those call for papers are there, but we will post some links at the end here as well. But again, thank you both for your time today. Any final thoughts or words?
It's been a real pleasure.
A real pleasure, isn't it? We could talk for hours on this, so thank you for letting us do that for the time of this interview. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Well, and for anyone listening, I should say there will be more to come, because this is the start of maybe a series of podcast interviews with different folks who have been working with or engaged with the Journal of Illustration, the conferences, the association, and topics around it. So watch this space for more. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you again on the next episode of In Conversation. Bye for now.